Welcome to Future Epoch, where we learn more about our world. In the early hours of February 24, 2022, sirens began sounding across Ukrainian cities. Explosions lit the skyline above Kyiv. Missiles struck airports, military installations, and civilian infrastructure from Kharkiv to Odessa. Within hours, a ground invasion was underway from three directions: north from Belarus, east from Russia, and south from Crimea. Vladimir Putin called it a special military operation. Most of the world called it something else entirely. What followed was the largest land war in Europe since the Second World War, and its consequences have reached far beyond the front lines. To understand what happened in February 2022, you need to understand what came before it. Ukraine and Russia share deep historical ties, centuries of intertwined culture, language, and governance. But the relationship fractured fundamentally after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, when Ukraine became an independent nation of more than 40 million people. In 2014, Russia annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula following a popular uprising in Kyiv known as the Maidan Revolution. A separatist conflict simultaneously broke out in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, backed by Russian forces. Low-level fighting continued for 8 years, killing more than 14,000 people before the full-scale invasion began. By early 2022, Russia had massed more than 150,000 troops along Ukraine's borders. Western governments warned an invasion was imminent. The Kremlin denied it until the morning it happened. The opening days of the invasion revealed a significant miscalculation. Russian forces advanced on Kyiv, expecting a rapid collapse of Ukrainian resistance. It did not come. Ukrainian forces, armed with Western-supplied anti-tank weapons and supported by real-time intelligence sharing with NATO allies, halted the northern advance. By the end of March 2022, Russian forces had withdrawn from the Kyiv region entirely. What was expected to be a swift campaign became a grinding war of attrition. Russia redirected its focus to eastern and southern Ukraine. Mariupol, a strategic port city on the Sea of Azov, was besieged for weeks before its fall in May 2022. The Azovstal steel plant became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance, soldiers and civilians sheltering underground under relentless bombardment before a final surrender. Through the summer and autumn of 2022, the front lines shifted dramatically. A Ukrainian counteroffensive in September recaptured thousands of square kilometers in the Kharkiv region in a matter of days. Russian forces retreated so quickly they left behind vehicles, weapons, and supplies. In November, the strategically important city of Kherson on the western bank of the Dnipro River was liberated after Russian troops withdrew. But the war did not end. Russia responded with a campaign of systematic missile and drone strikes targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure through the winter months, deliberately cutting power and heat to millions of civilians as temperatures fell below freezing. The city of Bakhmut in the Donbas became the site of some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire conflict, eventually falling to Russian forces in May 2023 after months of brutal attritional combat. By 2024, the front lines had largely stabilized into a war of position, with neither side achieving decisive breakthroughs. Ukrainian forces launched a cross-border incursion into Russia's Kursk region in August 2024, the first time foreign troops had occupied Russian territory since the Second World War. The war exposed the central tension of the post-Cold War international order, the question of sovereignty versus great power ambition. On March 2022, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution ES 11.1, demanding Russia immediately cease hostilities and withdraw its forces. 141 countries voted in favor. Only 5 voted against. The resolution carried no enforcement mechanism, but the vote sent an unmistakable signal about how most of the world viewed the invasion. In March 2023, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin on charges of the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia, a war crime under international law. It was an extraordinary step, a sitting head of state of a permanent UN Security Council member, subject to an international criminal warrant. The war also exposed a fault line within Europe itself. NATO allies broadly united behind Ukraine with financial aid, weapons deliveries, and punishing economic sanctions on Russia. But the scope and speed of military support became a persistent and often fractious debate. Ukraine repeatedly requested longer-range weapon systems, advanced air defense, and fighter aircraft. Western governments delivered many of these over time, but often cautiously, wary of triggering a wider escalation. Russia responded to each new Western weapons delivery with warnings about nuclear consequences, a tactic that shaped Western decision-making throughout the conflict. The specter of nuclear risk became a permanent feature of the war's political landscape, constraining allies in ways that Russian conventional forces alone could not. The consequences of the war extended far beyond Ukraine's borders. Ukraine and Russia together produce roughly a third of the world's wheat exports and the majority of the world's sunflower oil. When the invasion disrupted Ukrainian ports and Russian exports faced international sanctions, global food prices spiked sharply. Countries across the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, already facing serious food insecurity, were hit hardest. A United Nations brokered Black Sea Grain Initiative allowed Ukrainian exports to resume in mid-2022, but Russia suspended the agreement in July 2023, again threatening supply chains that hundreds of millions of people depend on. In Europe, the consequences were immediate and severe. Russia reduced and eventually halted natural gas flows to much of the continent, which had built decades of energy dependence on Russian supplies. European governments scrambled to fill the gap with liquefied natural gas from the United States and Qatar to accelerate renewable energy deployment and to reduce consumption through emergency conservation measures. Energy prices surged, contributing to the highest inflation across Europe in a generation. The war also permanently reshaped the geopolitical map of Europe. Finland and Sweden, both long-standing neutral nations that had remained outside NATO throughout the Cold War era, applied for membership within months of the invasion. Finland joined in April 2023, followed by Sweden in March 2024. NATO's eastern border with Russia expanded by more than 1,300 kilometers almost overnight, precisely the outcome Russia had claimed the invasion would prevent. The economic cost within Ukraine itself is almost incomprehensible. A 2023 World Bank assessment estimated the cost of reconstruction at more than $486 billion, roughly 3 times Ukraine's pre-war annual economic output. More than 8 million Ukrainians had been displaced abroad by mid-2023, with millions more internally displaced. Entire cities had been shelled, infrastructure networks destroyed, and agricultural land contaminated with mines and unexploded ordnance that experts warn could take decades to clear. The war in Ukraine is not simply a regional conflict. It is a challenge to the rules-based international order that emerged after 1945. The principle that borders cannot be changed by force, that sovereignty must be respected, and that civilian populations cannot be deliberately targeted as instruments of military strategy. What makes this conflict uniquely consequential is the scale of global entanglement it has revealed. Food systems, energy networks, international institutions, and military alliances have all been tested simultaneously. The conflict has demonstrated that in a deeply interconnected world, a war fought on one continent does not stay on that continent. It has also exposed the structural limits of institutions built for a different era. The UN Security Council, where Russia holds a permanent veto, has been architecturally unable to act. The ICC's arrest warrant carries real moral and legal weight, but no enforcement power. The gap between international law and the international capacity to enforce it remains very wide. The war in Ukraine has already lasted longer than most of the conflicts that shaped the 20th century. It has cost hundreds of thousands of lives, displaced tens of millions of people, and permanently altered the strategic landscape of Europe and the world. What happens next remains genuinely uncertain. Whether this conflict ends through negotiation, through exhaustion, or through a decisive shift on the battlefield, the world it ends in will not be the same world that existed before February 24, 2022. The principles that governed international relations for 7 decades are being contested, openly and violently, in real time. The question that remains is not simply who will win in Ukraine. It is what kind of world emerges on the other side, and whether the institutions humanity built to prevent the worst of itself are still capable of doing that job. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel.